Hey, come along with me. Let your spirit run free along the old Black Nile.
Good afternoon. It's 5 o'clock on Wednesday. You're listening to WPFW. This is Tony Browder with the Browder File. I want to start off today's program by giving a big shout out to WPFW. Last Saturday, Muiza Mthali, host of Africa Now, opened the International African Film Festival with a screening of Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. It's an award-winning documentary that illustrates, that documents the USA's role in the murder, the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, the legitimately elected president of the Congo. It talks about the role of the CIA, USAID, and other nefarious forces in overthrowing this person who only wanted to liberate himself and his people. Quite a stark film that shows the role of music and intrigue and political machinations on the lives of people in Africa and around the world. The screening of this movie was followed by a panel discussion, which was moderated by WPFW's own Katia Stitt, and two panelists, Tom Porter, who's certainly no stranger to WPFW, and Maurice Carney, who also is heard frequently on these airwaves. Tom left the audience with some poignant thoughts to consider when he said, paraphrasing, "America is dying, but it's us who will determine what will be born next." So in other words, Tom reminded us or encouraged us to focus our attention not on the fear associated with death and dying, but we should instead focus on the beauty that comes with birth, because that's where the power is. And so what we think determines what we give birth to. Our thoughts are things that we bring into existence. So what we think and how we think determines the ideas and principles that will map out the future, that will impact future generations. And if you need any further evidence that America is dying, or at least the oppressive system that operates in America is dying, then I encourage you all to listen to the broadcast of Kaba's show on Monday, 3 o'clock Monday, on his program, African Deep Thought. It was there that he shared evidence that one of the primary reasons why America doesn't have free healthcare is because it would benefit African Americans primarily and extend our lives. And that there are folk who don't want Black people to live longer, and who certainly don't want Black people living healthier lives in America. I mean, it was a sobering and thought-provoking program where Brother Kaba shared information that was new to me, and just made me realize where we were, where we are, and what it is we must do. So I encourage all of you all to revisit Monday's show, 3 o'clock, 3 to 5 here on WPFW. Go to the archives and listen to it. And I think that should help adjust your mindset as to how you should spend the rest of this week, the rest of this month, the rest of this year, and ultimately the rest of your life. So I say all of that to say I thank the creator and the ancestors for WPFW. And I thank all of you who have supported this radio station, this liberated frequency that shares news and information that is not heard elsewhere in this country. PFW has been at it for almost 48 years. So I give thanks to you who supported this station and for those who created and have maintained this institution. What PFW is to be in the future will be determined by what you do now. Speaking of now, yesterday, March the 18th, 2025, was the 90th birthday of my mother, Ann Browder. Yesterday was also the 90th birthday of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Both my mom and Dr. Welsing grew up in Chicago, and both moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1970s, where they lived the rest of their lives. They passed 44 days apart, and I was truly blessed to be at their bedside when they made their transition and helped assure their passage from this world into the next. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the passing of my mom. Today, March 19th, is also the 10th anniversary of the passing of Dr. Ben, or Dr. Yosef Ben Yuckanan, as he was known to others. I made my first trip to Africa with Dr. Ben in November 1980, and I first heard Dr. Ben when I was visiting in LA in 1980, listening to a local PFW station where they aired a broadcast of one of his lectures. And to hear this man talk about African people and African history and African culture the way that he did literally changed my thinking. And I bring all of this up because this is a season of remembering and transitions. Tomorrow is the first day of spring, which marks a season of transition or a season of new beginnings. And what better way to begin than by remembering those who brought us into the world and who opened our eyes to the ways of the world, which help us understand that every ending is a new beginning. So it's all about Sankofa, family. It's all about remembering our sacred obligations to go back and to dig up the knowledge of the past and to preserve it so carefully for the benefit of future generations. My guest today is W. Paul Coates, and he's been doing just that for decades. Paul Coates is the founder of Black Classic Press and BCP Digital Printing. Paul has revived lost literary classics, Black Classic Press, that's where the title comes from. And he has also preserved the legacy of new ancestors by printing, on the BCP digital side, printing the homegoing programs of distinguished members of our community. Paul has done homegoing programs for my mom, for Dr. Wilson, for Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Dr. Newton, and others in our community. So Paul, welcome back to the Browder File. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, Brother Browder, and that you're reciting how those elders, those ancestors who have transitioned and gone on, bring solemnity to this moment, and causes me to just remember and be with them. You basically did a libation, calling to the ancestors, and all of those ancestors, and Browder included, made significant contributions to my life and to our lives as Black people. So thank you for acknowledging. And I think your acknowledgement of WPFW is right on point as well. Congratulations, WPFW, for all of the years and all of the people who have come through WPFW to make it live as a living institution. Absolutely. Really, really thank you.
Absolutely. And
I'm doing great, Tony Browder.
Oh, well, good, man. I mean, you're looking good, even though we're on the radio. I can see you via Zoom.
Okay.
And you're looking well. And I'm glad to see that, man, because we are living in trying times. And, I saw you at the film festival on Saturday, and it was a packed house. And I think everyone left that theater that afternoon, Saturday afternoon, feeling more sober and compelled to do something to change this monster that has been destroying lives of millions of people across the planet. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes we feel helpless to stop this beast. But when we stop and think about the people who not only gave their lives and made sacrifices, we are encouraged to do whatever we can to join these soldiers to free this planet for the sake of those who are coming behind us, our children, our grandchildren, and those yet to be born. So that's what this beautiful struggle is all about, Paul.
Yeah, it is. I think you're so right. One of the things that I was touched by at that event, and for the listeners, if you have not seen Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, it is a must see. It's one of those films that comes along And I don't recommend films like this or books like this all the time, but it's one of those things that we need for our collective memory to be well, for our family memory to be well, for our connection to our struggles to be well. Like yourself, there's so many things in that movie, so many things I thought I knew that I didn't know. I actually bought the movie on DVD. I've gone to see it at least 2 times on the big screen in addition to the DVD. And every time I look at that movie, I see something different. I see something different, or my understanding gets enhanced. So much. So the thing that came to mind to me, Tony, is that I didn't feel any anger in that theater. I felt like soberness, you know, anger in the sense of I'm going out and kill somebody. I didn't feel that. I felt people reinforced in their understanding of what we're up against, the monster that we're faced with. And so I felt sobriety in there, and I felt comradeship of the folks who were there in the theater at that time. And to me, that's a good thing. When you don't have the senseless ranting, that people are made steadfast in the direction that they were already headed in. And this becomes something that grounds you even more.
Sure. And I think part of the soberness that everyone experienced was led by the music and the musicians, because all of the musicians that were featured in Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat are some of the greatest jazz legends, and they all were serious about their music, committed to the struggle for African liberations in the United States and across the world in the 60s. And we saw their commitment to the struggle, and we saw them see how they were being used and how they rebelled against them being used. Comments made by Louis Armstrong were quite telling. And it just shows that we cannot ever let our guard down, because the forces of evil are out there, and they'll use every means at their disposal in order to gain power and maintain power. And we're facing the same forces of white terror domination right now at this moment. And so it reminds me that there is nothing new in the world. Things just have a habit of changing themselves, modifying their appearance. But the struggle is real, the struggle is eternal, and the struggle can be a victorious one if we follow the examples of those who were fearless enough and determined enough to make whatever sacrifices were required.
That's true, Tony. It's the same. We're just in an extended battle.
Absolutely.
We're in another phase, another campaign. As they are, the forces that oppose us. They want to take us back to enslavement. You know, they want to take us back to that point. They want to make us lower than what they are. That's the constant battle, to make Black people lower than what they are, because it hides who our enemy really, or at least our enemy thinks they can hide in that space. We're in a continuous battle, and it's a glorious battle that our ancestors waged. When you think about it, they waged it at a time of our enslavement.
No question.
You know, they waged it at a time that they had no right whatsoever to wage it, other than the right of being a human being. We have no choice but to continue that fight.
You know, the other idea that the film reinforced is the power of the arts to transform consciousness. I believe it was Paul Robeson who said that the role of an artist is to shape the consciousness of a nation and to move people forward. So we had a chance to see some of the jazz greats not only perform but live what they were performing, live what they were playing, live what they were writing. And you know, the main reason why you're on the show today, Paul, is to talk about the extension of using art as a means of transforming the consciousness of the people. Instead of music, we want to focus on the literary arts. We want to focus today on this incredible publication, Survey Graphic, the book, The New Negro, and Alain Locke, who had a role to play in both of these publications in promoting the Harlem Renaissance, which essentially was the rebirth, the renewal of an indomitable African spirit that again rekindled this spirit that refuses to die, this spirit that refuses to be shut down, this spirit that has always been there and shows up in different forms at different places. So if I understand correctly, Survey Graphic, the monthly publication, was your first publication of BCP Digital. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. It was actually the first book that Black Classic Press printed.
Okay.
We printed a few pamphlets before then. We took a couple of chapters out of books and made them into pamphlets. So there were like maybe about 5 or 6 pamphlets that we had out in 1978, 79. And then Survey Graphic was the one that I literally decided would be our first book. It was and the readers, I don't know how many of the readers are familiar with Survey Graphic, but I encourage you to let me back up a minute, Tony, because you called our elders and our ancestors into this space, and so I want to go back and do the same thing. So March is the centennial. It is the centennial of that event, that movement that we call the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, the Harlem Renaissance really, even though the writers existed before that time, but the publication of Survey Graphic in March 1925 actually signaled to the world that there was such a thing as Harlem writers, that Black writers were in movement, that Black people in Harlem had come together and formed something culturally, not just in the arts, but culturally in their manners and their way of being. Their movement, their migration out of the South, that large migration out of the South, had congealed in Harlem in a particular way in which something new was born. And it's not like Black people didn't go to Chicago where your family went. It's not like Black people have not gone to California. In Harlem, though, you had this concentration of Black people from all over the world, and they brought their gifts, their food, they brought their manners of being, they brought their literature, they brought their art, they brought their culture, their way of being to Harlem. And it was in explosion at the time that the good brother Alain Locke brought it together in this publication called Survey Graphic, which would later go on, he would later go on and do the publication that many people are familiar with, The New Negro. In between those two publications, he signaled to the world that there was such a thing as the Harlem Renaissance, that here you had new Negroes coming forward. And in those new Negroes coming forward, they were proclaiming themselves to the world that we exist as an entity of people, and we have a culture that we're promoting.
You know, in preparation for this interview today, Paul, I was revisiting Wesley Snipes' film on Dr. Clark, A Great and Mighty Walk. And in the early part of that film, Dr. Clark talks about when he was a high school student, and he decided to impress his favorite teacher, Miss Evelina Taylor, and wanted to write an article for a Friday activity that they did. And he went and found a copy of The New Negro, right? And read an article called The Negro Digs Up His Past by Arthur Schomburg, and talked about how transformative that article was, that it told him, it showed him, it taught him that he came from a people with a long, rich history that had been erased, and that forces back in the, the turn of last century, the 1920s, the 1950s, 1970s, even to this very day, forces are still trying to eradicate, to erase, to deny. And that it was reading that one article that prompted a young 18-year-old John Clark to jump on a freight train and make his way up to Harlem, where he met Arthur Schomburg, and Schomburg set him on the course that began his first step that ultimately culminated with his great and mighty walk. So, we're not just talking about poems or essays written by people just to express their displeasure with America or to talk about how bad Black people are. We're talking about transformative experiences that far exceed the power of the individual who wrote them or produced them or played them, man. This is a powerful medium we're talking about.
Yeah. It still, it was, and it still is. And thank you for, because I missed that story, the connection of Clark with Survey Graphic and the New Negro. I missed that. But it's not surprising when you think that publication, and for the listeners, Survey Graphic at the time, and it was forever, a white publication. So you have to keep in mind that this is a white publication that many people in DC know the name Alain Locke. They know the name Alain Locke through its connection with Howard. But this is a white publication that the editorship is turned over to this Black man. And he is featuring the events of Harlem and what's going on there. Now, it's real interesting, though, that what they didn't touch, the live wire, they didn't touch the electric rail in this one. They didn't deal with Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey had been imprisoned by then, but the Garvey movement was still powerful. They had no article in there on the Garvey movement. Every once in a while, somebody would mention Garvey or something. But part of that, I'm sure, has to do with the audience, the white folks in this audience. However, the things that they were able to express, it was a conversation about Black people that elicited among Black people tremendous pride. But it also was an eye-opener to white people who had no inkling that Black people were talking about history, that we were talking about the importance of our history, that we were talking about the importance of our music, that we were talking about the importance of art, that poetry was existent and what have you. Storytelling was there, that there were deep essays on the history of Africa and African art, for example. Not just Black Negro, quote unquote, Negro art, but African art. All of that was bound up in this journal. And one other thing, the most famous Black man in the world, the most famous Black man in the world at that time was Roland Hayes, and his portrait graces the cover of Survey Graphic. Now, people don't know the name Roland Hayes so much now unless you're connected with music, but trust me, he was bigger than Muhammad Ali, okay?
So who is Roland Hayes, Paul?
Okay, so Roland Hayes was an opera singer. He was an opera singer who literally was hosted for a good portion of his life in Europe, by kings and queens and what have you. In fact, there is the thing, Tony, where there was I don't think she was Russian, but she was related to Russian royalty and stuff, quote unquote, stuff like that. She was married. Roland Hayes and that woman got together, and she basically divorced the cat she was with, right? Had this baby by Roland Hayes. That child grew up, and I can't remember the child's name, but people can look it up online. It's because it's a well-known story. But Roland Hayes had that kind of influence. I mean, the women would just die for Roland Hayes, man. This badass Black man.
Well, your description of him reminds me of Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson had that larger than life persona. He was an opera singer, an actor, an athlete,
Yeah,
the type of person who inspired a lot of people
yeah,
and
yeah,
stoked fear
yeah,
in other people as well.
yeah.
Because
I think the large difference with Robeson, I think the large difference, his spirit politically always drove him.
sure, absolutely.
And I don't think we find the same thing in Rolling Eight.
Mhm.
For example, he stayed out of the country as much as he could, as long as he could, and then he finally came back into the country. And his singing, like at all of his concerts, he did what is quote unquote Negro spirituals, because he came up in that tradition, but he did it in an operatic way.
Mhm.
However, the point is, he was the most famous Black man. He was one of the most famous men in the world, but
Okay.
the most famous Black man at that time, and people all over the world knew who Roland Hayes was. His picture is on that cover of Survey Graphic.
Right. And so you mentioned that the Survey Graphic, Alain Locke's editing of the special edition, the Survey Graphic, which was published on March 1st, 1925, served as a foundation for the book, The New Negro, that Locke would write later on, The New Negro and Interpretation. So this was Locke also professing to America and professing to the world that this is a new group of Negroes here, new group
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Black folk, Afro-Americans,
yeah.
who are connecting with our culture, reclaiming our cultural identity, reclaiming our heritage. And even though we are citizens of America, we claim that aspect of our African identity that America has always sought to oppress. So, how did that aspect of the Survey Graphic and even the book itself, The New Negro, how did that concept sweep through the Black community, and how well was it received?
So I think what we really have is Locke's interpretation of the New Negro.
Sure.
Because the term New Negro, Black people had been referring to themselves as New Negroes back to the probably late 1800s, and certainly early 1800s. And throughout the time going into the Garvey movement and folks, the term New Negro was there.
Sure.
And people referred to themselves as a New Negro to distinguish themselves from Negroes who were subservient, who were willing to take anything from the white man
Mhm.
during our enslavement and immediately after our enslavement. So what they were talking about, this is a new type of Negro here you're dealing with. You ain't dealing with the old Negro. So be clear on that. What Locke does to that is now that was largely used within Black folks. Black folks knew what we were talking about when we say New Negro, okay? Locke does a different thing because now he's taking it out of our community into white folks. But Locke is also giving it a spin. He's giving it an interpretation, like the book says, right?
Mhm.
It's like not his term. He's interpreting it to mean a particular thing. And what he's meaning is, yes, the militancy is there, but also there's a cultural awareness there. And in that cultural awareness, we're aware of a whole lot of things. We're aware of our African past. We're aware of the European present. We're integrating those things into who we are. And here, look at the expression of it. You'll see all of this come together. You'll see that we talk about how our music flows. You'll see how we talk about how our art flows, how our language flows, period. That was more, he saw the New Negro, I think. And look, I have to base this a lot because my understanding of Locke and the New Negro, I already had an understanding. And then a friend of mine did a book. A friend of mine did a book called Alain Locke, called The New Negro, Alain Locke and the New Negro. Look, here is the thing. Jeffrey Stewart did this book on Alain Locke that just expanded my understanding. So I'm sitting up here talking like I know stuff, right? Now
Well, Paul, hold on before
I
you
know
talk about,
stuff, but
hey,
I
Paul,
really come out of being immersed in Jeffrey's book.
so let me before you talk about Jeffrey, let me just remind our listeners that they're listening to WPFW, they're listening to the Browder File, and they're also listening to the great W. Paul Coates of Black Classic Press talk about Alain Locke, the New Negro, and a wonderful publication. So before you talk about this book on Locke, let me just ask you one question, going back a minute about this idea, this concept of the New Negro. If I'm not mistaken, didn't you also publish a book called The Word Negro by Richard Moore, The Word Negro, Its Origin
Yeah,
and Evil Use, or something like that? So
that is correct.
I assume then that there were elements within the Black community in Harlem and elsewhere that rejected the use of that word and sought to dispel it from our vocabulary.
Yeah, and now the interesting thing about that is the discussion of what we call ourselves and what we call ourselves and who we are, how we define ourselves has been ongoing.
Sure.
You know, I mean, it goes back. You got the African Episcopal Church, the AME. African Methodist Episcopal Church. African Methodist Zion. It goes back. African Baptist. So it goes back, and then you deal with color, and then you deal with Negro and what have you. So that dispute goes on. At the time that Locke is doing that, he, of course, is speaking at a time that they're struggling to get Negro capitalized. More, but by the time Richard B. Moore is writing, which again, John Clark is a part of that committee that does that book. Okay, The Name Negro. There was a Harlem committee on, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but they met all the time. Richard B. Moore's led that committee, and the book actually was the outgrowth of the discussions and lectures they had. John Clark was a member of that committee, okay? So by that time, we're talking about the early 50s.
I see.
You see what I'm saying? So we're talking about 25, 30 years later. And at this point, Richard Moore and John Clark and all them folks are saying, no, we ain't no Negroes. Let's get rid of that term. We ain't talking about no new Negro. We're talking about African. There were a couple of terms that they came up with. And I think finally his was Afro-American. I believe that was his preference. But that's it's a great book, and it's a great look at actually our history, how we got the name Negro and what that name means. But in the 20s, they weren't thinking about that. For example, Marcus Garvey wasn't looking that way. He certainly knew the term.
Sure.
He certainly knew the term, but Garvey always capitalizes it. You see, that in itself was revolutionary, because white folks didn't want to capitalize.
Sure. Just as they didn't want to capitalize Black either.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the second or third time you brought Garvey's name up in this conversation, and I'm in the process of finishing up our exhibit for the Clark Enhanced History Project in the Thurgood Marshall Center, and I just about a year or so was made aware of a document, a letter, an actual letter that was written by Marcus Garvey in August of 1916 when he was a resident in the 12th Street YMCA. He lists that as the address.
Wow.
His address, right?
Wow.
And then he stayed, I'm not quite sure how long he stayed at the 12th Street Y here in DC before he moved to Harlem and then literally blew up. And that one of the most successful Black movements in world history.
Yeah.
So Harlem was a place where people would go to expand their consciousness. Absolutely. And I think it also reinforces the value of what you're doing, Paul, in terms of rescuing these Black classics that would have languished in obscurity were it not for your love of reading, your love of Black literature, your love of Black people and Black culture. You bring these classics back so that we can have tap into a stream of consciousness about decades old discussions about who we are,
Yeah.
where we come from, and where we're going. So you were talking about Jeffrey Stewart's book, The New Negro.
Yeah, and Tony, I just want to follow up on what you're saying.
Of course.
What you're saying is true. That's really what inspires me, because I recognize that there's a whole conversation that our ancestors left in their dialogues, in their writings, in their books. There's a whole conversation about who we are and the information they really wanted us to have. And that information is available to us if we only look at it.
Sure.
If we just look for it and we just look at it, what we've managed to publish is relatively insignificant in terms of what's out there and what our ancestors left was. And you can understand that if you think about, we're talking about hundreds of years, and we're talking about literally thousands and thousands of contributors. What we're doing and what I've been able to do is pull some gems, only a few of the gems that are out there, and bring them together, if anything, to show people what is available.
Sure. So what leads that process, Paul? What causes you to, of the thousands of books that are out there, what causes you to stop and focus on a specific book and say, this is a gem that I want to share with my community?
You know, it has to do with a knowledge of the landscape, or knowledge of what's out there. And the more you know about it, the more you can distinguish that something's different, something special. It's just like, I'll give you a good example. At least I think it's a good example, okay? I'll go back to my jollof rice, man. If you eat jollof rice, the first time you have it, you may say, oh, this is pretty good. The next time you have it, you say, oh, damn, this one is great. You go someplace else, you say, oh, wow, wow, wow. And then if you eat enough of it, you get used to it. And then somebody will give you something. You say, oh, whoa, this is it. So it's a matter of experience in the field with whatever it is. And in my case, as you pointed out, it happens to be books. It happens to be documents. It happens to be the narratives. And so when I crossed Survey Graphic the first time, you know how I got Survey Graphic. There's a brother in Baltimore, Ronald Rooks, who was a collector and who was an auctioneer. I'm not auctioneer, I'm sorry, an appraiser. He was an appraiser. He had a antique shop in Baltimore. And I went in that shop one day thinking that he might have some old books, because I had heard he collect books. He's a funny guy, man. We became friends for life. I mean, really, really friends for life. He died a couple of years ago. But in that first meeting, he said, I don't have no black books. I don't have no old black books, because I'd asked him what he has on. He said, I got one thing though. And he went upstairs, because this antique shop had a second floor. He left me downstairs. He went upstairs, he came back, and in his hand, he had this copy of Survey Graphic. And I'm looking at it. And I knew about Alain Locke and the New Negro, but I knew nothing about Survey Graphic. This is 1977, 1976, something like that. I knew nothing about Survey Graphic.
2 years after the publishing of that particular book.
I'm sorry?
Oh, 50-something years after the book was originally.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, 50-some odd years. So I'm looking at this book, and I've always heard about, I knew the New Negro, I'd seen that, I've seen copies of that, but I'd never seen this. And there is that black man's face on the cover. When I open the book, there are black people inside that are graphically done. There's beautiful artwork in it. There's poems, there's everything. I knew this was something that I had never seen, and I knew most folks had never seen it, because it wasn't available. It just was not out there. So Tony, he sold me that book. I asked him how much it cost. He said $12. I said, look, I want that book, but I don't have any money. Can you hold this book for me? He said, yeah, I'll hold it. I ran across town. I drove across town to this brother and I borrowed $12 from him. I went back and I bought that book from Ronald Brooks, and I ended up paying the brother back. But I knew I had to have that book.
Sure.
And I knew that when we were publishing, that it was the book that I wanted to get out first. It was in between that and Drusilla Dungy Houston's Wonderful Ethiopian. Here's what happened though. I was set to go to press with it, and I saw an advertisement by this young, it announced the survey graphic. And it announced that that survey graphic was going to be published by this young Black scholar, unknown at the time. And I said, I can't let this happen. I got to go ahead and get this book out. So I was publishing the book. At that time, it was $6.95. They were going to bring, the company with this guy was going to bring that book out at $24.95. This is in 1978, 1979, $24.95, something like that. Mm-hmm. I know the book could come out and be available to people at $6. I got the book out. I ended up going away to graduate school, but I managed to get the book out before I left. Tony, that young scholar, and this would have been his very first publication, was Henry Louis Gates.
Wow.
Yeah, Henry Louis Gates. He and I never talked about it because once I did the book, once I got the book out, his company dropped it. His company dropped it. Yeah, his company dropped it. Which takes us back to Jeffrey Stewart, because Henry Gates would have had some inkling, he would have had some understanding of Locke at the time. He would have had a definite understanding of the Harlem Renaissance at the time. But if he had done an introduction, it would not stand up to, again, the mind-blowing stuff that Jeffrey Stewart has done in his book. Jeffrey Stewart, the book I'm talking about again, Alain Locke, gosh, he got the Pulitzer Prize for that book in 2018. He got the National Book Award, the American Book Award for it. And that was because the book is that damn thorough. Jeffrey must have spent, I met Jeffrey as a young man. He must have spent at least 40 years working on that book because he worked on it when he was a student. And I'm so glad because again, the book is a tremendous book, and we're going to be in discussion with him this week coming to talk about his book. The book is a comprehensive look at Alain Locke. It's a comprehensive look at the new Negro, the book, but also the concept of new Negro. It's a comprehensive look at the Harlem Renaissance and the characters and the different fights and the different people that went on back at that time. I am so pumped and ready to talk to this man, who is a friend,
Sure.
Because he's going to give me insight, and he's already corrected some misinterpretations that I had, and opened up some other things, So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I encourage people to look for the book. It's in libraries, it's in paperback now, so it's affordable. But set yourself up for getting an understanding of that period, getting an understanding of the Black world during that time.
Well, Paul, I was, student at Howard University. You were at Howard University, working at Howard. And I recall Locke Hall, Locke's name on the building. I didn't know much about him in the 70s when I was at Howard. I also learned about William Leo Hansberry, someone who you are quite enamored with, and you published a couple of books on Hansberry. We both are familiar with the Hansberry's daughter, Gail, who lives in the area. But it was only maybe a decade or so ago when I found out about this controversy between Locke and Hansberry with regards to traveling to Luxor, Egypt to visit the tomb of King Tut. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and how it turned out and what it tells us about Locke and his character?
I think it's Locke and it's Hansberry too. Now, look, I have to base this on Jeffrey. Jeffrey is my only source for this. But he's the one that did the work. He's the one that's got the receipts, okay?
Okay.
But it seems like there were periods in which Hansberry was being attacked by Locke. There were periods in which Locke was being attacked by Hansberry. Both of them had their camps, you know, and it really had to do, yes, it did have to do with going to Egypt for the reopening of Tutankhamun's tomb. It had to do with that, but it also had to do with the founding of African Studies, or an African Study department at Howard University. Both of them wanted the same thing. They just saw it differently. You know, they had two different approaches to it. Hansberry had his people on campus that did a job on Locke at one point, okay? And they did it after that trip, but they did a job on him. And Locke had his people who put Hansberry in the pocket. It's a real interesting story that I think, again, people will get more of the inside, as opposed to me doing shorthand notes on it. People get more of the inside of it reading Jeffrey's book, or again, joining us for this discussion that we're going to have with Jeffrey, because that definitely is one of the things I'll have him.
Well, good, because, you know.
But it was a two-way street. It wasn't like Locke was just beating on Hansberry. They were beating on each other. And they, you know, intrigue, like underground intrigue. Like Emmett Scott on one hand is opposing Locke, and he's in Hansberry's corner. And then you have other folks who Locke has and who Locke knows, who's opposing and doing stuff there, working with the president there, you know?
Okay. Well, I remember reading in one of Vance Sertima's journal. It was I think it was an interview that Runoko Rashidi had done with John Jackson. And Jackson had recalled that Hansberry was at Harvard and pursuing a PhD.
Not a PhD.
A master's?
Hansberry, yeah, because he couldn't get no one could teach Hansberry African history.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong now, because Hansberry was pursuing this advanced degree, but Reisner, who was chair of the Egyptology department at Harvard, is the person who refused to allow Hansberry to complete the program. And because of the fact, and correct me if I'm wrong now, I see you shaking hands. But one of the reasons why, one of the debates as to who would go, because from what I understand, Hansberry was certainly qualified to go to Egypt for that opening of Tut's tomb, because he had the history degree. Locke had the degree in literature, was it?
Philosophy,
yeah. Right. And he was he graduated from Cambridge. He had a PhD, so he had all the credentials, but Hansberry did not, but Hansberry had the knowledge. So was that the source of the animus between the two, or was it more to it than that?
I think, now see, here's the thing. Hansberry wasn't allowed to get his advanced degree because what they said, no one could teach him. You know, no one had that background in African studies that could teach him. Now, and you have to correct me, but I think Hansberry's degree was from Columbia, I think. And he wanted the degree at Harvard, but I don't know that he took the class. I can't remember that. I just don't remember that part, Tony. However, the point is, I'm very clear that they wouldn't let him get that degree. Here's the deal. Locke was supposedly a Rhodes Scholar, though. And in ranking, although he didn't have a PhD, he supposedly would have had more ranking than with Hansberry, because he would have been through more studies. And he did have history in his background. He wasn't a historian, though. Jeffrey will tell us about Locke's degree or lack of degree or what have you. But the point is, Locke actually had more credibility, not because of his connection with Rhodes. So when he came back from England in 1913, this had been 10 years before this happened. When he came back as a celebrated scholar. So he was in with everyone at that point. He was Booker T. Washington's main man at one point, traveling around the country with Booker T. Washington. And he was on the Theodore Roosevelt, the Woodrow Wilson type of tip. Okay. I mean, he was like a conservative. This is Locke.
Okay.
This is conservative. But he had all the credentials. He had spoken all over the country. The people, Black people loved him. And the American Negro Academy, more importantly, loved him. So these were the people. These were Schomburg. This was John Bruce. This was W.B. Du Bois. Even though he and Du Bois had conflict even then, these people embraced him. These were the people who lobbied the president at Howard for Locke to go. You see, Hansberry didn't have that kind of juice. Hansberry he'd come to Howard, what, in 23? Right about that time, right? I think that's when he graduated. He came to Howard. Sometime in that early 20s, he came. Locke had already been there for 10 years. So Locke had credibility at Howard. He had credibility in the American Negro Academy. These folks raised money for him to go. Even Carter Woodson gave money for him to go.
Okay.
Look, I don't know all this stuff, y'all. Look, I am simply parroting my man's book. Again, he's got the receipts, okay?
All right, well, look, man, you're doing a good job parroting, and I'm going to ask you to parrot your parroting down because we only have about 3 more minutes.
Got it.
So talk about this event that you're having on Sunday. Your guest, Jeffrey Stewart, and extending an invitation to.
So Tony, again, this is the centennial of Survey Graphic, the Harlem Renaissance, and I felt that we had to do something. And the best thing that I could think to do was hold a community-wide discussion. So we're doing that by Zoom on Sunday, the 23rd, March the 23rd, and our guest is Jeffrey Stewart. And I have been preparing all month to have this wonderful, lively conversation, to ask some of these questions like you're asking me, to get corrected on so many things, that I think I know, but I don't really know them. I mean, and that's the whole point of having a discussion, right? You want to learn more. So that's going to be a Zoom call. And I encourage people to go to the website, blackclassicbooks.com, for more information on, and there should be a link up that you can go from there to just register for the Zoom call. The Zoom call, it is filling up. We've got about 500 seats, and there are more than 300 gone at this point. So I do encourage people to register in advance and join us, because we're going to make time available so people can ask their questions. Okay.
Good. So you said it's this Sunday, the 23rd of March?
March the 23rd at 6 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to get together, and people will get a link for it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. My guest today is the inimitable W. Paul Coates, the man who is a master of many things, publishing and Black history and you name it. I mean, Paul's a true.
He forgets a lot though. So
well, look,
you driving me back. I'm gonna have to go back and read up on Hansberry.
But look, but you were the first person I know who spoke of Hansberry as if he was a deity. I mean, you just really extolled the academic virtues of this man, and you were close with his daughter Gail, and you just recently republished some of Hansberry's work. So I grew to appreciate him because of your love for his scholarship, man.
That's great.
You've always steered me in the right direction, and I appreciate you for it, man. I really do.
Well, I appreciate you for making me go back, because I got to go back to stay fresh.
But that's what it's all about.
Thank you.
So, but thank you, Paul. Thank you for stepping up and being my guest today. It's always a pleasure having you on the air, and we will have you back. And I look forward to the next chapters in our lives, because there's always something new going on, brother. Always something new going on. But thank you so much, brother. And
thank you, brother.
Travel safely back to DC.
Yes.
And we'll talk soon. Thank you.
All right, brother. Thank you so much.
That was W. Paul Coates of Black Classic Press of BCP Digital. You know, Paul is no stranger to the DC community. He's no stranger to the literary community. Those of you who live in Baltimore know Paul as being one of the principals with the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party. And at one point, I love to hear Paul share his stories about the Black Panther Party. And I guarantee you, you'll come away from that conversation with an expanded understanding of what Black liberation really is, what it really looks like, and what it ain't. Yeah, so this has been another edition of the Browder File, and I'm encouraging you all to tune in next week. Next week, we're going to have a very special guest. All of my guests are special, but I've got a very special guest coming on next week. And you know what? I might as well tell you who it is. It's Carl Nelson. Carl Nelson. I'm sure those of you in the DMV are familiar with Carl. I've known Carl for decades, and I want to invite him on my show so we can flip the script and I can interview him. We can talk about his life, his work, and why he does what he does. And so here at the Browder File, we want to bring you news and information, talk about information that should be uppermost in your mind, but do it from a slightly different vantage point to expand your understanding of who you are and who you have the potential to be. We are at a very important point in history, sisters and brothers. And I want to go out on a point that I made when I came in, talking about something that Tom Porter, former general manager of WPFW, former host of a show that ran for years on WPFW. He says, America is dying, but we don't have to die with America. We can determine what will be born next. And I challenge you to be a part of a birthing process, to give birth to something that is going to be lasting, something that is going to be sustainable, something that will infuse life and love into your loved ones and help to truly make this country and this world a better place. We can only do that if we put forth a serious effort. And that serious effort always begins with you knowing yourself and loving yourself. So each week we close out with our closing theme, Earth, Wind, and Fire, all about love, with Maurice White telling us, pleading with us, putting it to us in a poetic expression, how important it is to have beauty in your life, to love yourself, to love you for who you really are, not someone's false interpretation of who you should be, but to love your authentic self. And as he says again and again, you got to find the beauty. And if there ain't no beauty, you got to make some beauty. So Khalil, thank you again for engineering our program this week, and take us out, brother. Peace. See you next week.
I'm trying to tell you, you gotta love you. You gotta learn all the beautiful things.
Trees and birds. And if there ain't no beauty, you got to make some beauty. Tony Browder out. See you all next week. Peace.